And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominick, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, will these retro 80s glasses improve my chances at the bingo parlor? And will this Social Security check cover Grandma's pharmacy bills and also booze? And now, the podcast host who maintains his creepy old guy status every time he goes to the playground alone, Pete Dominick.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much, Pete Cohen. Thank you for downloading, for listening, for reviewing, and for supporting this independent media daily podcast. I'm Pete Dominick. That is Pete Coe, my announcer. We'll get a news dump jingle from him coming up as well. The music is written and performed by the great Grammy Award-winning John Carroll. Love the support of all of the community and very happy to have you listening to today's podcast. It is Monday, the 7th of June. Here we are starting the second week of June 2021. We're doing it together, or at least I'm doing it with you, and I hope to see you this Wednesday, not Thursday night, our usual hangout. Had to cancel on account of I was ill last week. Feeling much better, by the way. Still a little under the weather, but had a great weekend, feeling better, but I'll do the program, the hangout rather, Wednesday night, 8 o'clock. I hope you can be there. If you're a subscriber, you're a member of the community, you're always welcome, you're always invited. We have a great time every week. But this week, this Thursday, I am out of here. High school reunion with 19 of my male friends from the class of 93, Marcellus Mustangs. We call it Stang Bang, which sounds like the gayest possible thing ever, and maybe it will be. We'll see. Maybe some guys will finally decide this is the time to experiment a little bit. We're all around 45, 46 years old, and this weekend we're getting together, rented a house in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, and it's going to be a riot. I cannot wait. I'm even thinking of taping some interviews with some of my friends, maybe sharing them if they want, because I want to talk more about guy stuff. America doesn't seem to know what to do with men, and men don't seem to understand, American men, what to do with ourselves. Thank goodness there's so many people out there that have been my friends, giving me advice, lent me an ear, a hand, a dollar. Thank you for all of you who are subscribing to this show. And if you aren't, you can right now go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick, or just click on the paid subscription link in the show notes. Also give the program a 5-star review, because I do it 5 days a week. Give it 5 stars for each day of the week that I publish a podcast. Post a podcast, each one of which is my baby. Today's guest, Zachary Karabell. Usually I have a couple of guests, sometimes increasingly Mondays, just one guest, but the other 4 days of the week, usually 2 guests, because just easier that way to get it done. And I'm very excited to introduce you to him and his work if you're not already familiar with him. He's got an awesome new book. It's called Inside Money, Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. It's like the history of finance and investment banks and even money in the United States of America. It's so relevant, so important. We had a great conversation. Fascinating guy, really cool guy, and I think you're going to like it a lot. But first, it's time for the news, what I call this first part, the last 24. Yeah, let's take a look at what happened, listen to what happened on the Sunday shows and over the last 48 hours. The former one-term disgraced president and reality show star apparently is definitely now going to be suspended from Facebook for the next 2 years, just in time for him to run again, by the way. And Trump returned to the stage with a speech at the North Carolina GOP convention, sounding like a way past his prime performer and maybe wearing his pants backwards. Here's CNN's Jim Acosta opening his show on Sunday, talking about the president's terrible speech and performance.
Groundhog Day without the comedy. In other words, very repetitive and not very funny. Former President Donald Trump's first official speech in months saw him repeating the same old tired lies about a stolen election that wasn't.
That election will go down as the crime of the century, and our country is being destroyed by people who perhaps have no right to destroy it. I am not the one trying to undermine American democracy. I'm the one that's trying to save it. Please remember that.
For 85 minutes, it went on like that, low energy to say the least, an airing of grievances about Biden, the economy, China, immigration. I know it's tempting to laugh this off if it wasn't also dangerous coming 5 months after a Capitol insurrection inspired by lies. Republicans still caught in the grips of a man who incited a mob, and perhaps in a telling twist, one of the songs played before he came to the stage was the theme song to Titanic.
I thought that was good. Jim Acosta at CNN. The big news, however, over the weekend, the really big news was that West Virginia Senator and man with a face that looks like a bird of prey, West Virginia's Joe Manchin, announced he would not be supporting the Democrats' bill to combat voter suppression. That's right. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia said on Sunday, in no uncertain terms, he would not vote for this bill. He would never ever end the legislative filibuster, a written promise in a op-ed that imperils much of President Biden's agenda. And boy, did everybody react to that as one would expect. He posted this, by the way, in the Charleston Gazette-Mail. He wrote, "I believe that partisan voting legislation will destroy the already weakening binds of our democracy. And for that reason, I will vote against the For the People Act. Furthermore, I will not vote to weaken or eliminate the filibuster." The reactions came hard and fast, folks. According to one analysis, by the way, this is a bipartisan bill. H.R. 1 for the People Act is wildly popular. It's got support of 56% of Republicans, 68% of independents, and 77% of Democrats. In total, 67% of Americans support H.R. 1. Denying H.R. 1 to protect the racist filibuster is absurd, tweets my friend Qasim Rashid. Julian Castro writes, "We can't foster bipartisanship without a properly functioning democracy. The filibuster is preventing both. I hope Joe Manchin understands this before it's too late." Joanne Reed tweets, "Arizona's former Republican AG says Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin should abolish the filibuster or resign." Wow. My friend Scott Heckinger, who is a public defender in Brooklyn, tweets simply, "Fuck Joe Manchin." Well done, Scott. Robert Reich, "Make no mistake, by refusing to end the filibuster, Manchin and Sinema are giving Republicans the green light to cheat their way to victory in 2022, 2024, and every election thereafter. If the senators don't reverse course, this will be their legacy." Presidential historian Douglas Brinkley called it baloney. Senator Joe Manchin's claim the filibuster stance is about protecting the Senate. Here he is on CNN with Pamela Brown.
Manchin has become a media star as being the guy who holds the Democratic Party in the balance. It's unfortunate. You would think at this point he would get behind the fact that the Republican Party is gerrymandering, trying to disenfranchise voters. But alas, he wants to be seen as the maverick of West Virginia on issues of voting rights, which has a lot to do with race. Manchin isn't a progressive. He's more worried about his future in West Virginia politics than he is helping the Biden administration succeed. So the filibuster looks like it's here to stay. Any hope is going out the window with Manchin's wiping his hands and saying, "I'm going to leave the filibuster alone."
So really quickly, you're saying this is about Manchin wanting to stay in power. Now, as we know, Senator Manchin has said, no, this is about protecting the Senate and the institution. What do you say to that?
I think that's baloney. Manchin is looking after his own hide here. We're in a very divided country, and for Biden to have a setback like this simply because of somebody that caucuses, is with part of the Democratic Party, it's unfortunate. And I think Biden should call Manchin out by name instead of doing, low ebb kind of, there's somebody that's causing a problem. Voting rights now are being threatened in the United States, and Republicans are scoring a big victory because of a Democrat from West Virginia.
Presidential historian Douglas Brinkley on CNN. Let's head over to MSNBC, where Mehdi Hasan, hosting his show on Sunday night, broke it down real good, broke down some myths, and took it out on both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who really deserve this. Mehdi Hasan for a couple minutes.
Republican Party has launched an unprecedented war on American democracy, in which shamefully they are now being aided and abetted by at least 2 Democratic senators. Joe Manchin of West Virginia today announced that he will be voting against the Democrats' sweeping election reform bill known as the For the People Act. But even if the problem of Joe Manchin was solvable, he isn't the only problem in the Democratic caucus.
I've long been a supporter of the filibuster because it is a tool that protects the democracy of our nation rather than allowing our country to ricochet wildly every 2 to 4 years back and forth between policies. The reality is that when you have a system that's not working effectively, and I would think that most would agree that the Senate's not a particularly well-oiled machine, right? The way to fix that is to change your behavior.
That was Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona on Tuesday during an appearance at the border with Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn. And no behavior is being changed by the filibuster. Zero. Zip. Nada. Because there's absolutely no incentive for change. In fact, that's one of the 5 biggest myths about the filibuster that keeps getting pushed by Sinema, Manchin and co. That it promotes compromise and bipartisanship. Actually, it's the opposite. Senators know they don't have to compromise as long as the other side doesn't have the 10 votes to overcome the threshold. 9 GOP senators didn't even bother to show up last week to the January 6th Commission vote, safe in the knowledge their votes weren't even needed to block it. Myth number 2, the filibuster protects democracy. Nope. What began as a means of cutting off a senator during a long debate is now the means for the minority to block any and all legislation. When you get 54 votes for a bill in the Senate and still lose to 35 votes, that's not democracy. Myth number 3, the filibuster comes from the Founding Fathers. Do we indict the U.S. education system for this myth? The Senate didn't see its first filibuster until 1841. Myth number 4, there hasn't been any big increase in the use of the filibuster. You know what? I'm going to let the orange in that graph do all the talking about the rise of the filibuster over the last century and especially recent decades. And myth number 5, the filibuster, well, it helps and hurts each party equally. No, complete and utter nonsense. As my good friend and MSNBC colleague Chris Hayes pointed out on Friday, the only 2 things the GOP cares about are tax cuts and judicial nominations, neither of which are affected by the filibuster, whereas Democrats actually want to pass legislation and govern. So they get screwed again and again by the filibuster. Joe Biden's getting screwed by it right now. It's asymmetric warfare from the right. And now, scarily, the future of our democracy is also on the line.
All right, Mehdi Hassan on MSNBC breaking it down and busting all the myths. Well, Joe Manchin, for his part, not only did he write an op-ed, he did go on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace, who did not go easy on him. Here is that.
I'm not going to ask you again. You said that you oppose scrapping the filibuster. The question I have is whether or not, and you say you hope that that'll bring the parties together. The question I have is whether or not you're doing it exactly the wrong way. And hear me out on this. If you were to keep the idea that maybe you would vote to kill the filibuster, wouldn't that give Republicans an incentive to actually negotiate, because old Joe Manchin's out there and who knows what he's going to do by taking it off the table? Haven't you empowered Republicans to be obstructionists?
I don't think so, because we have 7 brave Republicans that continue to vote for what they know is right and the facts as they see them, not worrying about the political consequences. I believe there's a lot more of my Republican colleagues and friends that feel the same way. I'm just hoping they are able to rise to the occasion to defend our country and support our country and make sure that we have a democracy for this republic of all the people. I'm just very hopeful that I see good signs. We're doing, Chris, more things than ever before. Give us some time. I know everyone's putting deadlines. Well, got to be done by this, and this.
But let me ask you the final question, sir. I mean, let's just take the idea of creating a 9/11 commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Republicans blocked that. Senator McConnell, the head of the Republicans in the Senate, says that he's 100% focused on blocking the Biden agenda. Question, aren't you being naive about this continuing talk about bipartisan cooperation?
I'm not being naive. I think he's 100% wrong in trying to block all the good things that we're trying to do for America. We'd be a lot better if we had participation, and we're getting participation, but when it comes time to final vote, I disagree with Leader McConnell on this, the minority leader on this issue, that he puts politics before the policies that I think we need for our country. I'm going to continue to keep working with my bipartisan friends, and hopefully we can get more of them. I can tell you this, in 2013, at that time, Harry Reid, the leader of the majority party, the Democrats, basically the nuclear option, which did away the filibuster on appointments and district and circuit judges. Comebacks 2017, then we had Leader McConnell at that time in the majority, and he did away with it for the Supreme Court. So what goes around comes around here. They all understand that, and there were 33 Democrats in 2017 that signed a letter to please save the filibuster and save our democracy. That's what I'm trying to do.
No, he's not trying to do that at all. Of course, he's not trying to do that. He himself admitted that if they couldn't vote for a bipartisan commission to investigate the terrorist attack of January 6th, why on earth would they vote to support democracy and not voter suppression tactics? That's how they win. That's how Republicans win. They have no interest, the vast majority of them, in voting for the People Act. I mean, they think, at least, that it would contribute to them losing elections. So it's just terrible. Joe Manchin is absolutely terrible, and there's very little, I think, that we can do about him. I'm still hoping for something. Who knows? There's still time. So frustrating. I do want to share one more clip on this. This is my congressman in New York's 17th Congressional District. He's a freshman, and he was on my friend Ali Velshi's show this weekend. Here is Mondaire Jones trashing Joe Manchin in a sound, thoughtful, yet acerbic argument.
I read that op-ed this morning by Senator Manchin, and I don't know where to begin. It is, in the first case, intellectually unserious. I mean, this is someone who talks about how we need to pivot to what he describes as bipartisan, which means he only has one Republican in the Senate who will join him. John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but Mark Elias just presented to Senate Democrats a week or so ago, in which he described how even that bill, which has not yet been introduced, will not have retroactive effect. So it would not undo the voter suppression that has been enacted in Georgia and in Florida, and that soon will probably be enacted in Texas and elsewhere in the country. It is also the case that this idea of bipartisanship is not something that should have inherent value when the other side is actively working to dismantle our democracy. We have a majority, and we must act now to protect our democracy, which is slipping away. We're going into a redistricting year. There's going to be partisan gerrymandering, unlike anything we've ever seen by the Republican Party. More Marjorie Taylor Greenes, more Louis Gohmerts, more Jim Jordans. And now we have the opportunity to actually do something about it. And Senator Manchin would rather preserve Jim Crow on some outdated theory of bipartisanship that frankly does not exist in the same way today as it did a generation ago before the advent of Fox News and other right-wing propaganda machines on television, and of course the rise of Donald Trump.
Well done, Congressman Jones. That's Mondaire Jones on MSNBC with Ali Velshi, and that is the chunk about Joe Manchin, lots of different perspectives in the man himself. And that is the kind of robust context you're going to get here on Stand Up with Pete Dominick late as I tape it on a Sunday night. Now, several of you have reached out and said, I'd love to hear more segments on the future of energy and the climate crisis and what we can all do. Many of you have said, I'd love to talk more about mental health and just share your journey and your coping mechanisms. I will be doing a lot more of that here on this podcast. You're going to hear all kinds of different guests coming up, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from you and what you'd like to hear so we can evolve and develop and get as many great conversations, expert guests on as we can. Well, speaking of climate, I do want to play a little of Bill Nye, the science guy from Ali Velshi's show as well, and maybe you're rolling your eyes at Bill Nye, the science guy. I interviewed him several times. He's never the friendliest guy. He's definitely not mean or rude. He's just kind of matter of fact. And he's always the consummate performer and a great communicator. Maybe you don't like that this guy has to be the out front communicator. I do. I don't mind it. Either way, I think he's good at it and think he generally does a pretty good job. And I don't know why I've spent so much time talking about him. Let me just play Bill Nye, the science guy, who Ali Velshi smartly had him on to talk about why the Biden administration not selling out the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas drilling is such a good thing. Bill Nye explaining why this move is just the first step to a better global future, and also previewed his congressional testimony on threats to our national security brought on by climate change.
Tell our viewers why this is an important move by the Biden administration.
Well, the more oil and gas we continue to extract, the more we're going to be making producing greenhouse gas emissions. So just fundamentally, the less drilling we do, the better. The sooner we wean ourselves from these energy sources, the better. Now, the other big problem we have globally is this loss of biodiversity. So this is bad in two ways if you were to continue to drill, because the other thing is this is a unique ecosystem with species that don't exist anyplace else. And so whenever you disturb their migration patterns, their population's going to go down. And so you don't want that. So it's bad in two ways, and stopping it is good in two ways. But man, I'm the first to admit we have gotten this far by burning oil and gas and coal, fossil fuels. But we have to cut it out. We have to stop. And so the sooner the better.
There you go, little Bill Nye, the science guy. He'll be testifying this week. And also, speaking of energy and climate, here is Energy Secretary, former Michigan governor, and all-around brilliant person I've always liked, Jennifer Granholm. Here she is talking about the infrastructure bill on CNN's State of the Union.
Bill's money that was unspent pre-American Rescue Plan, the stuff that was passed last year, and say, all right, I'll give you that. We'll put that toward it. He's come in their direction on the rates from 2017. That was their red line. He gave that back to them. It's just, it is frustrating that there's not more coming together on this. But as the president's red line, as you have heard, is that inaction is his red line. So there will be action. We're just hopeful that we can see it in a bipartisan way. That would be good for the country.
Yes, it would be good for the country, but why do Democrats keep saying we think we're holding out for bipartisanship? These people think you eat babies. Come on now. This is a ridiculous conversation. I'm not sure what the strategy here is. I mean, they know this, but they're dragging it out, I think, a lot longer than needs to be. Let's go. Let's move. Now, here's a guy who tells it like it is. He is the lieutenant governor in Pennsylvania. He's also running for Senate there. And he says if you tell the truth in the Republican Party, you lose your elective career in politics. Let's listen to Lieutenant Governor and giant, super intimidating guy, John Fetterman.
This is what they do. This is all they know, and this is all they have to run on it. And currying the former president's favor is their only play to be electorally viable nowadays in the Republican Party. And that's a tragedy. If you tell the truth in the Republican Party, you lose your elective career in politics. We've seen it with my counterpart in Georgia and across the country. The bottom line is this. No one, including the Republicans themselves, believe there was any fraud. They know better than anybody what the results are. And this is strictly about simping for Donald Trump. So he curries favor and they endorse him. He endorses them and they ultimately would win in their respective primaries.
All right, there goes John Fetterman, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania. And now, finally, on to the latest COVID news. COVID news! It's time for COVID news. Do we need a jingle for that? Is it almost over? By the way, just an update on numbers. I was just reading this and realized I hadn't heard these numbers in a long time or hadn't looked at them in a couple of weeks. But the coronavirus pandemic has affected nearly every corner of the globe. It's sickened more than 173 million people worldwide. More than 3.7 million people have died so far. 3.7 million people. In the United States, we have now just surpassed the 600,000 mark officially, and it's sure to be far more than that. The actual real number, I mean. And, well, here are some of the headlines. British tourists scramble to return from Portugal to meet a new quarantine deadline. New York is turning to smart thermometers for disease detection in schools. Mississippi is the state with the country's lowest vaccination rates, and the governor there doesn't think that's apparently a problem. Senators announced that a vaccine donation while visiting in Taiwan. U.S. senators who were visiting in Taiwan announced a vaccine donation. Also, the rush to vaccinate the world stalls as funds and doses fall short. And one more headline on COVID. India's capital will ease some restrictions on Monday, even as it prepares for a possible third wave. And half of all people in the United States have started the vaccination process. 41% are fully vaccinated, including me. And my wife, my daughters both have their first shot. But the number of doses administered each day has fallen by more than half from its April peak. So that seems to be problematic. Now, the big COVID headline has to do with the investigation into the origination of the virus. Did it come out of a lab? Was it an accident? It leaked out of a lab? Or was it something that went from an animal to a human? Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci's emails have been uncovered or FOIA'd, and so everybody's combing through them, some taking them out of context. I haven't paid that close attention to them. My brother thinks there's all kinds of problems here and is mad at me because I've paid too much respect, apparently, to Anthony Fauci. Maybe some of you feel the same way. Nonetheless, I think it's a very important issue, and I am going to continue to follow it and would love to hear from you. But here is Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner. He is on CBS Face the Nation. He was asked by John Dickerson, who's anchoring, what he'd seen or heard so far from the emails.
Thousands of emails of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, were released. What did you make of those emails?
I didn't think there was anything remarkable in those emails. I certainly don't think there was anything that Tony sent that expressed any ill intent, and nothing really that was new from the standpoint of what we already knew. I do think, though, that some of the discussion that went on in those emails evidences a larger issue, which is that early on, the email that's being focused on is a so-called smoking gun, if you will, was an email Tony received from some really good scientists suggesting that they felt this could have been an engineered pathogen early on. They were basing that assessment on their analysis of the sequence strain of the virus. So they were virologists looking at the virus itself. It was reasonable to draw conclusions based on an evaluation of the sequence because that was largely the best piece of information we had. As time evolved and as more virologists looked more carefully at this, the judgment of the scientific community is there's actually nothing that remarkable about this virus. All of the genetic diversity that's seen in the virus could have been derived from nature. There are some unusual features, don't get me wrong, but they are still things that we could have found in nature. So their initial analysis was based on the analysis of the sequence. Their current analysis is also based on an analysis of the sequence. And what is lost in this is that there's a broader mosaic here. You know, we have other information now that fits into this picture. The science is one piece of information, but there's a lot of other information that points in a direction that this could have come out of a lab, that we need to have a broader view about the potential risk that this was a lab leak.
All right, so your thoughts on lab leak, your thoughts on Fauci, I'd love to hear from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. That's all of the audio part I've got for you in the last 24 and the big stories, and now it's time to get to everything else. Folks, it's time for the news dump. What did I just turn into Snagglepuss, the cartoon cat? Remember him? Here he is.
What do you say to that?
Oh, I love the old cartoons. All right, here's Pete Coe with today's news dump jingle.
Angry cassowary claw makes a leg a stump. You're bleeding out at the knees on today's news dump.
Cassowary. Pete told me those are pretty dangerous. Well done, sir. Thank you very much. All right, let's start with the good news for Prince Harry and Meghan, who have been in the news a lot lately. They announced the birth of their new daughter. Of course it's new. Why did I say new? Like it's an old daughter? It's a baby. They named her Lilibet Diana. And apparently sources are saying that Queen Elizabeth responded with, "How dark is she?" No, I kid the Queen. I'm sure she's not a racist. I think it was her husband. Anyway, Arizona wildfires are burning 60,000 acres, forced hundreds of evacuations, and record-breaking heat across the Northeast and Midwest over the weekend continued into Sunday. Newark, New Jersey set a record Saturday with a high of 95 degrees. Washington, D.C. hit a record 92 degrees, and Bridgeport, Connecticut tied its record of 86 degrees. You know what I did? very hot here. I got up on the roof and I put on a shed. How about that? I got up on a shed and put on a roof, Said that backwards. I don't care. I'm not going to edit it out. Vice President Harris's plane was forced to return to Andrews Air Force Base on Sunday because of a technical issue with the aircraft. Her spokeswoman, Simone Sanders, said that Harris would be switching planes for a trip to Guatemala City because of a technical issue, adding that there were no major safety concerns. When asked if she was okay, Vice President Harris told reporters traveling with her, I'm good. She also gave a double thumbs up, apparently. Good reporting. The oldest male chimpanzee living in an accredited North American zoo died Saturday at the San Francisco Zoo and Gardens. He was 63. His name was Kabi. He'd been a hand-reared performing chimpanzee before he was brought to the San Francisco Zoo in the 60s. Although the zoo said in a release that the chimpanzee's cause of death had not yet been determined, apparently he was ill, and zoo officials say old age was a factor. Yeah, he was a 63-year-old chimpanzee. I didn't think he was bungee jumping. More than 600 small earthquakes have been recorded this weekend in a rural area near Salton Sea in Southern California, the largest having a magnitude of 5.3. Apparently 603 tremblers with a magnitude of at least 1 happened in the area Saturday just before sunrise Sunday. How about those California listeners? You guys feeling that out there? Is that scary? I've never experienced an earthquake. I don't think I want to either. All right, that is your news dump for Monday, June 7th. Thank you. All right. Now, let's move on to my guest today, who is a very, very intelligent guy. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to him. He went to Columbia and Oxford and Harvard. He's got his Ph.D. He's an author. He's a columnist. He founded the Progress Network at New America. He was the president of River Twice Research and River Twice Capital. He was the head of global strategies at a company called Envestnet, and he is an author. He's written several books, but he joined me to talk about his brand new book, which I'm really enjoying and learning so much about. It is titled Inside Money, Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. And it's a sweeping history of the legendary private investment firm Brothers Harriman, explores its central role in the story of American wealth and its rise to global power. I really enjoyed this book and this conversation. I think it's a really important history that he's given us. I learned a lot, and I'm happy that you're here to learn along with me today. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you at Zachary Karabell on Twitter, Dr. Zachary Karabell and his new book, Inside Money. Very happy to have Zachary Karabell on the show for the first time to talk about this great book. Congratulations. Inside Money, Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. Congrats. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Pete.
You've written other books, many books. Why did you choose to write a book about this firm, Brothers Harriman? You know, I've covered finance and the collapse of 2008. I'd never heard of this firm.
And I think a lot of people are in your camp, that it's flown beneath the radar, certainly in the past decades, even though they exist today as a private partnership with 5,000 employees, $2 billion in revenue and about $500 million in profit. And yet they are completely invisible. But it wasn't always the case. For much of the 19th century, they were like the Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and the Rothschilds for American capitalism. And I like telling stories. I like finding stories that allow us to shed light on who we are now and how do we get here. And Brown Brothers is like Zelig, right? At every important moment in American history, there's a Brown Brothers banker in the second row back left looking like a banker. They don't want to be the story, but without them, there's no story. And they are the driver of a lot of the world that we've come to live in a very quiet way, almost by intent. And I thought this was a great way, kind of like an exoskeleton, to write about the story of how American capitalism makes America, and then how American capitalists in the 20th century make the world, and then how they almost bring our own system down. And Brown Brothers is a not a cautionary tale. It's actually a points in a different direction about what a capitalism could be.
Yeah, it's not. It's a history book in many ways, but it's also extremely relevant to today's economic system, and especially to what we've seen happen in I guess the global financial system over the past several years. Do you do you have an agenda with this book? Do you have an opinion? I mean, you're obviously a progressive guy, but I mean, I when I first heard about your book, I thought, oh, am I going to argue about capitalism?
So progressives think I'm conservative, and conservatives think I'm progressive. So I'm not entirely sure what I am, but I do know that I've got my own opinions and my own views. And I do think that there is a kind of capitalism the Brown brothers came to inhabit that there's no way we're going back to, and we wouldn't want to. Right by the mid 20th century, they are like Exhibit A for the WASP elite establishment. They are the WASP elite establishment. They create the WASP elite establishment. But with that, there was these notions of my private gain and our public good are inseparable. That I can't beggar the commons endlessly. I can't get massively wealthy while everyone else treads water. That's not a sustainable system. And their vision of a sustainable system was like decades, generations, centuries, not next year. And so I do think that's a lesson to be learned. I do end up admiring it. But admiring it doesn't mean, like, we live in such a binary culture, right? The minute you say I admire something, someone says, oh, you've got these rose-tinted glasses. Come on, they were they facilitated the slave trade. They were imperialists. They created this elite system. All true. I just happen to believe that human beings are messy, complicated, hard to pin down, that you can be self-serving and of service, that you can be selfless and selfish. Those things can kind of coexist. And we don't really live in a culture where those are thought to be able to coexist. And that's my point of view.
So your point of view is nuanced and not binary, which I love.
Yeah, it's amazing that I end up talking on airwaves or writing anything, anytime. Sometimes people are like, wow, you do this. Okay, why aren't you doing it more? I'm like, look, it's extraordinary given what I believe that I do it at all.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm glad you do, because it's a great book. I'm learning so much. Again, Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman, and the American Way of Power. Who are these guys, the originators, the original masters of the universe? Because when you tell us who they are and how they're related, it does seem like, it's all conspiracy theory and the world is run by a few families or individuals. And that's all bullshit, but it's easier to understand why people think it, because you got the Prescott Bushes of the world in this firm.
Right. So most people have not heard of Brown Brothers Harriman, but as you just pointed out, they have heard of Prescott Bush because they have heard of George Herbert Walker Bush, and they have heard of George Walker Bush because they were both presidents of the United States. And
now George P. Bush, who's supporting Trump. Did you hear about that?
The next one, the next generation. Yeah. Well, there are a bunch of them. One of them supporting Trump. The others are doing whatever they're doing.
That's true.
And that's where the Bush family fortune comes from. And that's what allows him to be the patriarch of the Bush dynasty. And he marries into the family of George Herbert Walker, or Dorothy Walker, a St. Louis, businessman who manages the firm of Averell Harriman, who is the son of E.H. Harriman, who is this railroad baron who is just as important as Morgan and Stanford and these others. And they then intermarry with the Brown family, who started this firm in the 1800s. An very modest Irish linen merchant moves from the troubles of Belfast to Baltimore. And so it all begins. Everything has humble immigrant backgrounds in the United States, even the most elite establishment conspiracy theories. And that's worth remembering too, right? These are not to the manor born. They may be to the manor created, but they certainly, the manor was built sometime in the 19th century. It wasn't there from time immemorial.
Well, what? Yeah, go ahead.
No. So he says, they all end up becoming this very tight-knit, closed circle that seems to has fingers in every pie and is pulling the levers. But I think it's more complicated than that, obviously.
Yeah, and your book explains that. And specifically, let's just talk about what they did. I mean, what their bank became, what it represented, and how they came up with money itself?
Yeah, so in the 19th century, I don't think I realized this as much till I wrote the book. I knew about their 20th century, the wise men, the Prescott Bushes, Averell Harriman, a man named Robert Lovett, who was Secretary of Defense under Secretary of State, helps basically create the precursor to the World Trade Organization, they all create and administer the Marshall Plan. So I knew about that establishment. I wasn't as aware of how central Brown Brothers, before it was Brown Brothers Harriman, was to the creation of money and American wealth in the 19th century. And it's not just that they funded the first railroad ever, right? The first steam-powered locomotive, passenger and rail in the United States and almost in the world was the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O, the Monopoly Railroad, 1828, funded by Brown Brothers, not to make money, but because Alexander Brown, the patriarch, was worried that Baltimore was going to fall behind New York and Philadelphia, which it was and did, and that the only way to restore Baltimore was to do this public works, like Biden infrastructure. This was public works, except government didn't pay for public works. Brown Brothers did. They don't make a dime on the B&O. In fact, they probably lose money. But it gets built, and it doesn't save Baltimore, but it's done in that spirit. And then they create this whole paper money system. And the role of paper promises in transforming the United States relative to every society in the world has been chronically, I think, underappreciated. If you had a hope and a dream in the 19th century in the United States, you had an easier time getting money, someone writing a promise of money. Everywhere else in the world, it was gold, it was silver, it was people, it was land. And you could get money in the United States, and you could do something with it, and you could lose it, and you could make it, and you could lose it, and you could make it. And that was basically these volatile cycles. And here's Brown Brothers, a bunch of truly men steeped in rectitude, boring. And I say that guardedly. Like, I wrote a book about people who were self-consciously undramatic and not the story. and I believe that we should appreciate that more, because you don't want everyone to be Elon Musk, right? You don't want the center of your financial system to be people who are like, give me more.
Well, I guess it's a bad example, Elon Musk, because we're talking about banks and finance. We're not talking about cars, rockets, or energy, which is all super important what he's doing. But if Elon Musk loses, we don't all lose, as opposed to what happened in the global financial crisis. I mean, in many ways, I think your book also could be kind of a history of finance in America and kind of a history of capitalism and how it's really transformed, and how, as you're saying, they used to understand risk, and now risk doesn't matter because you can lose everything and still make millions yourself, even if you're firm. I mean, Lehman Brothers, like, it was this Dick Fold, the greatest name ever in banking. The business went under. Lehman Brothers was around almost as long as this firm, right? Brown Brothers?
Yeah, I mean, they were younger. I mean, just like, not that age matters, but they were like 70 years younger. And by the way, you're totally right about Musk. I guess the point is more, you don't all want to be the people underwriting Elon Musk.
Fair enough. Yes, exactly.
And that's not the outcome of every deal. And the reason why they don't become systemically dangerous, except briefly in 1837, but that's its own story, where they learned not to be systemically dangerous for the next 175 years, is that risk can upend the system. You need people to be more mindful of risk. That doesn't mean they shouldn't go after rewards. I think a dynamic system needs somebody going batshit crazy. But I think you need people to be aware of the volatile power of money and its dangers. And the fascinating thing about Lehman Brothers, right, by the time Lehman Brothers implodes in 2008 and brings everything else almost down with it, there are no Lehmans left. There's no Lehman Brothers.
Right.
The Lehmans are long since gone from the scene. It's just a name. Brown Brothers, I mean, yes, the family ends up ceding control, but it remains a privately held partnership where every single deal that firm did from time immemorial, they could personally lose all their money. Personally. Not shareholder capital, not Federal Reserve balance sheet, their own money. And one thing that happens in the 80s, and I'm by far not the only person to say this, is that the risks and rewards within the financial system get perverted or skewed, so that all the gains go to the individual and all the risks go to the public.
Me. Yeah. My house is underwater still. Right. Maybe not now because of the pandemic, ironically.
Or the Fed's going to bail you out. And maybe the Fed should. I'm not even actually taking an argument about that. I'm just saying, if you do a deal now, and this is true for hedge funds, it's less true for the financial system, it's true in the tech world, I might make $1 billion, but I am personally not going to lose $1 billion. That loss will be spread amongst a lot of anonymous shareholders, and then even at worse, amongst a lot of anonymous taxpayers.
And your point is, when these firms were started, they themselves were at risk. Their banks themselves were at risk, and that is no longer the case.
Right. And look, that didn't mean they weren't greedy, and it didn't mean they weren't selfish.
Right.
It just means their greed and their selfishness was constrained by their structure.
I also feel like it's a time when, we'll get back to the book specifically, but when you talk about banking being boring, these men being boring, they actually created something. I mean, they were financing, you mentioned the railroad. And at that time, it was before the New Deal, certainly before government's role changed and government invested more in infrastructure post, World War II, all of that. And so the private sector did have to invest to make things better. And you mentioned they didn't make any money on that railroad, but they created something. They financed projects or at least homes. And now so much of the financial industry, and I will paint them with a broad brush, they aren't creating anything. It's just.
Although, to be fair, in the 19th century, Brown Brothers made a lot of money issuing these things called letters of credit, which was the way that international trade was lubricated. The great question for trade from time immemorial is, I want to sell you something and you live far away. I want to know that I'm going to get paid before I send what I've got.
Right.
You want to know you're going to get what you're paying for before you pay for it. Someone has to be the intermediary. I mean, today it's Etsy or Amazon or whatever, or it's a bank. And Brown Brothers creates these letters, and they make a lot of money kind of backstopping those trades on either side. And they do it with paper. And, in the 1850s, they were railed against much the way we rail against Lehman Brothers for being too speculative. So, I mean, partly it's an attitudinal thing. I just think that this aspect of culture being tethered to the awareness of risk and danger and not just to the relentless pursuit of more is a healthier one. And the fact that they really did believe if you've got a lot of money and you're doing really well for the system, you have an obligation to serve that system.
That is something that you point out, and that has really changed. Having this moral belief of having an obligation to the system, and you can look back at all the other titans around that time as well. But things have changed so much. Things have changed so much, and it's not just the morality and the ethics, but it's actual, as you mentioned, trade, and global trade specifically is so much easier. And so there's so much more gambling and so much more to be won and lost. Let me go back though specifically to the book. Chapter 5 is titled A Very Civil War. You cover a lot of history, a lot of ground. What do we learn here about their role?
So look, Brown Brothers made a lot of money from slavery because they made a lot of money from the cotton trade. First, they were physical importers and exporters of cotton. I mean, exporters of cotton, importers of finished goods from the UK. And then as writing these letters of credit that underwrote the cotton trade, that gave that Southern planter some assurance they would get paid by that Birmingham cotton merchant. And they hated slavery, right? And like back to the nuance and the complications, they were complicit and they hated it. And they tried to get out of it. And eventually by the 1850s, they're moving away from the cotton trade. They become paying, members of the Republican Party, friends of William Seward. I mean, but they're still complicit in the system, just the irony of it all. And much the way, though, that every American in 1855, whether you were a Northern abolitionist or a Southern plantation owner, was complicit in a slave system. Because unless you weren't wearing cotton or you weren't trading anything with the UK, I mean, I use the analogy today, like we all think the carbon economy is probably dangerous for the planet. But very few of us are living in a yurt off the grid in Alaska. We are embedded in this system, even if we recognize both the moral and physical challenges of it. And that's kind of them in slavery.
I don't love the comparison, but it's accurate. I mean, it's accurate. It's just a different, I guess, threat, human chattelry. Versus the,
but it does play into, it is really difficult to get out of a governing system, even if you morally hate it.
There's no doubt.
That's my analogous point.
Well, you're talking about governing system. What about political systems? What role does this firm play in influencing law and influencing political campaigns? Because that is one of the big issues now with the financial industry. Not that they get whatever they want. They were actually regulated to some small extent after the financial collapse with the Obama administration, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And then, of course, Trump came in and undid as much of that as he possibly could. But they financed certain politicians to get certain laws, certain regulations. What role did the financial system and did Brown Brothers Harriman play back in the day?
Well, basically in the 40s and 50s, three of their partners, Aron Harriman, Robert Lovett, again, who became Undersecretary of State under Marshall and then Secretary of Defense under Truman, and Prescott Bush, they don't just influence the law; they make the system, right? They write the rules of this system. They help set up Bretton Woods and the dollar-denominated world that we live in today. I mean, the role of the U.S. dollar as supporting American economic power is impossible to overstate, and they write, they create the Pentagon, they create the National Security Council and the whole bureaucracy that fights the Cold War that remains this $800 billion or $700, whatever the number is, aspect of what we spend publicly and shapes our sense of policy. So they don't just influence law, right? They create the system. I mean, there's other people other than the Brown partners, but they are part of the system, and they do it because they think communism, if it takes over, is going to impoverish Americans in the world. They think it's going to impoverish them. They believe that a rising middle class is vital and that there has to be a system, hence the Marshall Plan, serving and self-serving. You know, if they do well, we do well. If we do well, they do well.
I feel like that's changed so much. And I know you have thoughts and opinions on that. There doesn't seem to be any kind of guiding moral principle for finance today. And specifically because their incentives are quarter by quarter. Yeah. And so they could care less about what happens to the planet, much less the country in, you know, an election cycle or in 10 years. They don't think about that. I'm not sure who they serve, if anyone, ethically. And I'm, you know, clearly you can hear how cynical I am about the financial industry, but, you know, where are the principles today? What are the driving incentives?
I think it's worse within the tech world, meaning it's not just the financial industry, it's the way in which we define capitalism and incentives, which are, again, quarterly, and they are, I get the gains, and the risks are kind of offloaded either onto shareholders, you know, Robinhood shareholders, who cares if they lose whatever they've put money in, onto the government. And they're not, Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State in the late 40s under Truman, wrote a memoir called Present at the Creation. And his point was that group of kind of elite white WASP men were part and parcel of creating that system, for better and for worse. But they were involved in the public debate. They were in the fray. Today, look, there's a lot of questions about privacy, about who's benefited, you know, during the pandemic. And, you know, we're talking on Zoom, but Zoom's a $96 billion company. I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm just saying there's been a lot of rewards that have been massively badly distributed.
So we're using a StreamYard link. This is their competitor.
I'm my bad. Same principle, different company.
Yep.
I'm struck by how absent, like, the tech world is from this idea of what is good for the commons, which is probably why the commons is saying, screw you. Like, there's nothing Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley agree with, except that big tech has abdicated its responsibilities to the common good and needs to be therefore regulated or broken up. And, like, the tech world is fighting either a rearguard action or is totally silent in this debate. And I think that's the incentives of capitalism. Like, it's detached them from the sense of, like, what's the public good, other than the public good as they define it.
There's one strong premise that I believe for a long time, and I haven't heard enough people talk about this, and I don't have any original thoughts, but this is close to one. And it is that capitalism is not in any way inherently patriotic to any country. And I think it's best illustrated in your book, because what changes over the time that you write about in this firm is how you can sell your product to anywhere, to anyone, anywhere. So it's not about America. I mean, people often talk about Henry Ford made his cars affordable enough for his own employees to buy, as if that was good character. No, that was just smart economics. If he could have sold his cars then efficiently to the Japanese or to anybody else, he would have, and he would have screwed his employees just like major companies do today. So what about that premise? Do you believe that? Do you have any thoughts about that? Capitalism isn't inherently patriotic to any country, because they'll sell you out, they'll haul you out, they'll put all their profits in another country and not pay dividends even often, much less higher wages to their employees. What am I missing about that theory?
I think the thing you're missing is that there are other definitions or variants of capitalism than that one, which is now the predominant one. Okay. Whether you call it shareholder capitalism or mercenary capitalism or all the things you've just articulated, there are other pathways within the envelope of making profit and having that be private, right? Which is kind of an undergirding of capitalism. But that requires a cultural change and a definitional shift, which we've done before and we could do again. You know, our particular notion of capitalism is a 1970s idea of everything you just articulated, or the shareholder one, right? That it's the privatization of gains and the public sectoring of risks. But the Brown brothers partners then and now would have had a very different cultural ethos, right? What you just said would have struck them as wrong, full stop, and not capitalist in a constructive way, because they really did believe that the society has to thrive for them to thrive ultimately. And look, there have been definitions of capitalism were different in the 19th century. There were others that didn't agree with Brown brothers then. I do think we can create different cultures, and that it's not all, sort of preordained. Everything changes. It's just kind of up to us to change it.
How did the ethos of service change from what they believe to what people believe now? I strongly believe in an idea of national service, and not in the military. There's this new concept called the Climate Conservation Corps, which the Biden administration, Democrats are rolling out. I think is a great idea. We've got AmeriCorps, and they're all flawed, but I think the idea of national service, mandatory even national service, is a good idea. How has the ethos changed?
I think part of it changed because the incentives changed. I think part of it changed in the 70s because there was kind of the revolt against the elites, right? That these guys were too exclusive. Nobody can join them. They weren't democratic. And there was certainly truth in that. They led us into this disastrous war in Vietnam. And there was still massive racial injustice that had been swept under the rug historically by those self-serving elites. But what that also led to is that, the idea of with great power comes great responsibility, which was the cliche, but it's what they lived. That also falls out of favor. I went to a private school in New York that was like at the tail end of Dead Poets Society without the sleepaway, that it had that kind of, you're the young men who will lead tomorrow and you're privileged, but that means you have great responsibility to do something good for the world. And that was hammered into us.
Have you talked to your friends from there? Where are they all now?
They are in a variety of places, but they are not they didn't typically end up where you thought they would end up. Okay. They didn't become the kind of the masters of the universe. They ended up having more balanced, constructive lives, which I never would have predicted when I was 18. I just would have assumed they would all have become, mini Gordon Geckos or Wolf of Wall Street, you name it. And that didn't happen. And it's much more likely to happen today where that ethos has disappeared entirely, replaced by kind of like, we should all get into Harvard. And if we don't, then everything else, or you should all make as much money as possible. You should all drop out and start a company and emulate, Elon. And that is a cultural shift. It's almost like we replaced a very sclerotic, narrow pyramid with a nothing that has led to more inequities than that hierarchical pyramid did. Like the world these guys created in the 1950s saw the average differential in income between the middle class and the CEOs about 30-1. And they really believed that like the middle class had to thrive, just like the progressive era believed that in the 1890s. Now it's 300-1. It's crazy. From a class that is supposedly more meritocratic, more open, not constrained by, birth and education. And yet it's a much more unequal system. And I don't entirely know why that is, but I know that it is.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I bet yours are more informed and more intelligent, and maybe we'll pick up.
It doesn't matter. Yours are probably just as trenchant.
Well, listen, you have a heart out, but I'm really enjoying your book, and I love talking to you today. I'd love to talk to you again, and I'm sure listeners are going to want to hear from you.
Let's do it again, man. This doesn't have to be a one-off. Conversations are meant to be ongoing, preferably late at night, preferably with substances to fuel them.
Well, if you want to do that next time, let's plan for that. I always tell people, I work during the day, but I've gotten to know you a bit here, and I'm thoroughly enjoying talking to you, and I thoroughly enjoy a drink or whatever, and I'd love to talk again. So congratulations on the book. I hope listeners will go out and buy it. It's just out, Inside Money, Brown Brothers, Harriman, and the American Way of Power. Absolutely fascinating, as is the author. Great to meet you. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
So what do you think of that? Zachary Karabell, Dr. Zachary Karabell. Check out his new book and follow him on Twitter. Let him know you heard him here, because this is the first time he's ever been on the program, and always good. And thank you so much to all of those of you who do. John Carroll, Tina Winsett, Kim Nyborg, and so many more of you thanking the guest. It really means a lot. I see every one of those tweets. So if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter just to thank the guests that join us here. And that was great. So thank you, Zachary Karabell. Thank you for listening and for supporting this daily podcast. I cannot do it without you. And I had a whole bunch of great conversations with listeners and contributors to the program on Friday. I think 4 conversations. Michael Acevedo, DJ Monzak, Jim Babowski just spoke with Dan Leaf and his son Vince about video. And so many great ideas that are coming in about developing and evolving the show and the community along with it. I would love to hear from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. You want to set up a call, you want to hang out. Join us Wednesday night at 8 p.m. where we will hang because I'm headed out Thursday. Normally we do it on Thursday. And if you haven't subscribed already, please sign up right now for a subscription. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. Also, give me the 5-star review. And that's it. I'm going to shut up now and let John Carroll sing us out. Grammy award-winning singer-songwriter and one of the most valued members of our community because he contributes so much and he's such a great, deep thinker. Love this guy. Take it away, Johnny.
Stand our ground and then stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know that it's time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it than now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run there.